Well, I'm now going to introduce our panel to talk about this. First up, Catherine Westoby is the Net Zero Business Engagement Lead at the Department for Business. And we have Chris Taylor, who is the Net Zero Lead at the Broadway Initiative. Stuart Gibbons, who's the Product and Marketing Director at Arval UK. And Sandra Roling, who's the Head of Transport at the Climate Group, EV100. Thank you, all of you, to being with us this morning. Reminder to you watching, please do send your questions in, and we will get to as many of those as we can. I want to start by going around and just asking what COP actually means for you and your organization, just to give us a sense of how significantly you're taking it. And Chris, I'd like to start with you, if I may.
Thank you. So the Broadway Initiative is a coalition of trade associations working together to mainstream sustainability, working with environmental, professional and expert groups. Our role on net zero really is to support trade associations to become leaders on net zero in their sectors by helping to establish the investment and technology pathways that are going to be required, positioning for the opportunities and collaborating with other linked sectors and government on common challenges. We work with around 20 of the main trade associations on sectoral roadmaps and on the advice offered to businesses across sectors to get to net zero, including through our advice portal at zerocarbonbusiness.uk. We find that trade associations are particularly well placed to take a leadership role here because businesses within a sector tend to face a common set of issues getting to net zero. Trade associations already have convening power, and because they understand the wider operating context for businesses, which will influence how and when businesses can transition to net zero in practice. I think for us, COP26 is a vital moment to concentrate minds and bring everyone together into the right partnerships. It's not so much about being physically in Glasgow or under the lights, but about making sure we're ready for the challenge ahead.
Great, thank you. Look, I want to ask a quick question about your work. You say you have lots of trade associations. Give us a sense of which sectors are behind in this, which sectors are ahead, and which sectors are most worried about it.
Well, I think the leading sectors include retail. The British Retail Consortium has been doing a lot of work on planning out pathways, also housing, the waste sector, and sorry, yes, those three are the ones that immediately spring to mind. Yes, indeed.
Brilliant, thank you. Sandra, we'll come to you next. Tell us a little bit about what COP26 means for you and the EV100 organization.
Yes, thanks a lot. So at the Climate Group, we're also an international NGO, and we're all about accelerating climate action. So we're very much looking at COP as hopefully a big milestone that will move us somewhat closer to a 1.5 degree and no more global warming trajectory. I think this is a moment that reminds all of us of the urgency of the challenge, really. I think at the Climate Group, we always like to talk about the climate decade to drive home the point that within the next 10 years, we need to halve our emissions if we're going to stand a chance. I think that's really an urgency that can't be overstated. But the interesting thing about COP is that on the one hand, you have the national governments, and that is obviously at the core of it, national governments from around the world coming together to negotiate more ambitious approaches to climate change and trying to ramp up the ambition. But there's also a very important body of work that focuses on the so-called non-state actors, which is basically all the entities that are national governments, but that also have an important role to play in driving the transition to a zero carbon economy. And that's businesses, that's cities, that's states, that's manufacturers of the technologies that we need, that's investors who are directing funding in the right direction. And I think one of the things that I'm particularly excited about this COP is that the British presidency has put such a big emphasis on clean transport. And we are actually, in some ways, I'm here with two heads today. One is our EV100 initiative, which brings together international companies that have committed to go electric by 2030. Maybe we can talk a little bit more about that as one of the pathways for businesses to get involved. And then also in collaboration with the high-level climate champions and lots of other partners, we've created a platform called Route Zero that brings together the leadership from initiatives like EV100, but also all the other stakeholder groups like C40, for example, around the cities, some of the subnational governments, etc., to bring all of that together and bring it to COP as well, to show that not only are governments willing to raise the ambition, not only is there potential for especially clean transport a big part of the agenda, but also that the transition is already happening, it's happening at speed, and it's supported by lots and lots of stakeholders around the world. And I think that's really what we need to create, because ultimately, as I think you said, Peter, in the introduction as well, COP is extremely important, but it's also just one of the milestones, and all the work to make it happen actually needs to happen in the run-up to COP, as it has over the past year and a half, and then also following on from COP to making sure that whatever is being decided is actually taken into reality in the years that follow.
Which is a really important point. We're going to come on to that obviously it's more than just the meeting, that you've got to have follow-up and long-term change that happens afterwards. Stuart, I come to you next. What does COP mean for you guys at Arval?
Thanks, Peter. So, yeah, it's had a huge influence on Arval, both at a UK level and as part of our global organisation. And clearly for us, there's a big focus, as a lot of topics this morning, on sustainable mobility, and I guess as part of that transition to EVs across both the car and the LCV market. So it's a huge influence on our business and how we transition our business over the next 5 years out to 2025. The big cornerstone, I guess, strategically for Arval is our Arval Beyond strategy, which takes us out to 2025. And there's a 16-point plan with significant focus on how we help our customers and fleets transition towards EVs, but also looking towards more sustainable methods of mobility, for example, e-bikes, e-scooters, e-cargo bikes as part of that last mile delivery piece within the delivery network. But also, I think Chris mentioned partnerships, and Sandra with the LC100, EV100. So we're part of the Hydrogen Task Force in the UK as part of a partnership in a group of people investing in hydrogen as a possible alternative fuel source, which we discussed this morning. And equally, where we've got clients that are already on the EV100 pathway, so supporting them on that journey as well, in terms of helping them understand their transition to EV and supporting that with their financing.
Great, thank you. And I guess the question for an organisation like yours is, wouldn't you be doing all this stuff anyway, given we're on a decarbonisation path? We know where the UK is going, we know what the 2030 targets are, and to some extent, we know what the global climate imperative is around this. Is the fact that there's COP26 happening in the UK and that there's all this noise around it, is that actually making a sort of noticeable, tangible difference to the way that you approach stuff? Or isn't this something that you'd be doing anyway?
Yeah, I think we've been on this journey for a couple of years, and it's clearly an important journey to us. I think as part of a bigger global bank as well, with really clear sustainability objectives around their investment strategies as well, beyond car finance, and we form part of that as our CSR agenda as well. And I think testament to a lot of the work we put into our EV migration, we're well ahead of other European countries, for example, in our penetration of EVs, and we see this as a really key part of our strategy to maintain relevance as the market moves into not just EVs, but the wider mobility or sustainable mobility offers. So I think it's critical for our business to thrive and to support our customers.
Great, thank you. Catherine, I'd like to come to you now. I mean, obviously you are, in charge of business engagement around net zero. What are the big questions businesses are coming to you with? And are you saying many of them actually referencing COP? Are they aware of COP? Do they have questions about it specifically? Or are most of their questions about decarbonisation in general?
Thanks, Peter. Yeah, I think there are some, lots of questions from businesses. I mean, I head up the small business engagement campaign ahead of COP. So our goal is sort of mass mobilization, really sort of targeting small businesses and explaining what net zero actually means. And you're right, there are lots of questions around that concept, because for lots of small businesses, and I'm talking about ordinary high street shops, the florists, the plumbers, etc. There are some sort of legitimate queries around that, because they haven't really heard that concept before. It's not really familiar. We use lots of different terminology, for example, around sustainability, being a responsible business, etc. So there is some confusion about where net zero actually fits into all of this. Where do I as a small business fit into this master plan, to this net zero agenda that the government has? So this campaign is all about sort of bringing net zero again down to the ground, really embedding it in these local communities with local small businesses, and really explaining what's in it for them, And to be honest, COP26 is an enormous opportunity for them. This is our chance to showcase what these small businesses are doing. Lots we're finding are taking action. And just to say, obviously, we're part of the global race to zero ahead of COP26. That's the global campaign led by the UN to get businesses, organizations, investors, etc., signed up to credible net zero targets. So the role that we're playing in that is obviously working with the SME Climate Hub, which is the way in, the portal for small businesses to join the race to zero. So working very closely with that international team to sort of put a domestic slant on this and say, what's in it for UK businesses? And we're getting as many as possible to make the SME climate commitment and join the race to zero that way. And we've got over 1,800 signed up already, which, given the wider context, given the struggles that small businesses have had over the past 18 months or so, is incredibly encouraging to see so many of them joining. I mean, it's absolutely fantastic that businesses are seeing the benefits of net zero and starting to understand what it means for them as a business, and they want to be part of this.
And look, give us the 2-minute elevator pitch then. If there are small business owners watching this, how do they fit into net zero?
Individually, obviously, those sort of carbon footprints are going to be quite small, or businesses might perceive themselves to be a very small cog in a very big wheel. But what we want to say is, look, collectively, all of you, if you make the SME climate commitment, if you join the race to zero, together we can have a really sizable impact. We know that small businesses, for example, account for roughly half of emissions in the UK. So it's really important that we act, as I say, as a group, that we mass mobilize, that together we all join the race to zero, make the SME climate commitment. And again, it just shows what can be done. It shows that there's this enormous latent demand in the UK to move towards net zero. And what they need really is that dialogue, is that support from government to say, look, here's how you do it. Here's what you can actually do as a business. Here's what net zero actually means for you, and just translating it down into a few simple actions that these businesses can take.
And it's interesting, you kind of referenced this in your earlier answer. Many small businesses over the last certainly year and a half will have had survival as the top of their list rather than anything else, given the economic climate. What help is there from government to help them shift and transition when that may not be the top of their agenda right now?
No, absolutely. And that's where we started from roughly a year ago when we began this campaign. Is, we were very tentative. We weren't quite sure how to approach this topic with small businesses, exactly because, it was obviously very, very trying times, very difficult for them. But what we're finding is that net zero is good for business, and that message is cutting through where, even simple things that businesses may already be doing, to sort of address resource efficiency, for example. Even really, really small actions that people have heard again and again, such as turning off your lights, going paperless, etc. All of these small actions are significant because that's the way that you can start your net zero journey. So when businesses visit the SME Climate Hub, and we have a UK landing page on that called the Business Climate Hub, so UK users will be directed to that landing page, they'll find a whole host of tools and resources available to them to support them in their journey to net zero. And we find the most important thing that we can do as government is listen to businesses and get them to say what they've been doing. Again, this is not about us going out and telling businesses what they should do. It's saying, look, here's a small business that's just like you, a small distillery in Scotland, for example, who's taking these really simple actions. They've managed to save money, they've grown their customer base, they've improved their reputation, etc. And all of those learnings can be passed on to other businesses to support them in their net zero journey.
Chris, thank you. Chris, can I come to you next on this? I mean, how much sort of cross-sector support are you saying? You must have retail organizations and trade organizations from one sector who discover things that others could benefit from. Do you see a real sort of information flow going on about this whole issue? Is it something everyone's really trying to pull together on?
Yeah, I think so. It's certainly something that is developing over time as each sector becomes clear about what their ambitions are. It starts to highlight the interdependencies between different sectors. Obviously, most sectors will be using transport in some form or another. Many will be relying on fleet. And so in order to achieve their zero carbon goals, they're going to start to need to lean on EV providers and so on to enable them to get their emissions due to transport down. But that becomes part of their plan. They then need the support from other sectors and from governments to get the component parts in place to allow that to happen.
And obviously, we know that transport is obviously a big chunk of businesses' emissions, but it's not all of them. Is transport still the big one that they're either trying to decarbonize first because it's easiest, or maybe struggling to decarbonize because it's harder if you're trying to run a fleet of vans? Or are there other areas in their businesses that they're looking at decarbonizing first?
Transport is clearly an important one, and I suppose in some ways kind of feels relatively tractable, perhaps, in that, excuse the pun, whereas other really important parts will be in decarbonising the supply chain, for example, and so trying to reduce carbon embedded in the products that are sold. If you're a retailer, you're selling stuff which has a carbon impact as well. So whilst transport is part of it, there are many other parts as well that also need to be considered.
Yeah, exactly. We were talking earlier in the EV supply panel about supply chains getting shorter and potentially more localized in an EV world. And it's interesting to see that that's a discussion that's happening all over across lots of different sectors. Sandra, can I come to you? Can you give us a sense of which types of businesses have signed up for EV 100? And I guess among those that you've talked to who haven't quite yet jumped over the line, what are their hesitations? What are their reservations?
So we work in some ways on the other end of the spectrum, mainly looking at major international companies, because I think part of the effect that we want to create is also this sort of leapfrogging of learnings and experience. So say if you have a UK headquartered company, there's obviously quite a bit of framework already around electromobility, but they might have operations in lots of other parts in the world. And if a company makes a global commitment to go electric by 2030, that automatically means then action happens in all these other places as well. And that's part of the effect. I think one of the things that we're really excited about, it's over 100 companies at this point, and they're really coming from all sectors and almost across all geographies. So you have sort of big UK brand names like BT, Centrica, etc. But you also then have the IKEAs of this world. You have leasing companies. You have Flipkart, for example. Flipkart is in the largest Indian online retailer. So I think that's a very interesting space. We have Lyft, which was one of the largest US ride-sharing companies. We have sort of over 2 million vehicles that are used on their platform. So it's very substantial fleets. And I think what it mostly shows is that really, the EV transition is underway around the world and works in lots of different sectors. And then obviously, the constellations of that depends on the use cases and on the type of business that you have. I think when we talk to companies, I think it's two things. And part of it is almost more of a cultural piece. Asking companies to make a wholesale commitment to 2030 is obviously quite a steep ask in some ways, especially if you have to do it around the world. So I think part of that conversation is about explaining our sense of leadership as well. I think we feel it's quite important that the companies do their homework, that they look at their carbon emissions and that they reduce them, but ideally to not just do that sort of, behind closed doors on your own, but to also be vocal about it, be public about it, because you can then share experiences and also you can be a voice, for example, at COP or in other, policy discussions, for example, as well. We have a group of businesses, for example, in the UK that we work with, the UK Electric Fleet Coalition, that very much says, we've made this commitment, we want to go electric. And on the journey, we're now having lots of learnings and experiences that we can share with government to help create the frameworks that are necessary as well. I think that's part of the leadership. And then, of course, lots of other things are more about learning. How do I get started? How do I bring my staff along for the journey? How do I find all the right vehicles, etc.? And obviously, again, that's where we can also provide a global platform to learn from the ones that maybe have taken some of those steps already, a few months or a couple of years earlier.
And given the kind of, corporate image benefits of signing up to something like this and taking decarbonisation really seriously, are you seeing that once, say, one big player in a sector decides to jump and sign up to the pledge, that you get others following on quite quickly afterwards because they don't want to be seen as the sector's dirty holdout?
Yeah, quite often. I mean, you certainly can see when big announcements come up, then you get some more emails from competitors potentially as well. But I think it's also, it shows that in some ways it's not just about the reputation as a climate conscious company anymore. I think it's really also about looking ahead at your strategy and what is going to future-proof your business. I think like the postal or logistics sector, sort of last mile delivery in cities is one of those key examples where customers really care about these sort of things. Green services are really important, but also city centers have issues with air pollution. Lots of cities have started to think about zero emission zones and things like that. So I think there's also a sense about, we know what the future has to look like in order to deal with climate change. So as a company that has as its primary business to deliver goods or services to customers, how do you make sure you can still do that in the future and can do that in a way that will be compatible with the policies that governments will have to take as well. And then you fairly quickly get to the conclusion that maybe now is the time to also get on the learning curve, so that when really need to get to a wholesale commitment, you've already gone through all the processes of the learning and the transition that obviously any big change always requires.
And talk a little bit about momentum. It seems that before the pandemic hit, there was a very large sort of almost global awakening to the climate issue and the urgency of it. That was then obviously put on the back foot immediately in the early months of last year when everyone was dealing with the first wave of the pandemic. Coming out of it, it seems it's only accelerated. Certainly it has in transportation. Are you seeing, a big rush of companies now taking the issue far more seriously than they were a year ago, 2 years ago?
I think I see it more as a continuation. I think lots of companies were already taking it very, very serious before. And then, of course, as you said, during the pandemic, we were sort of wondering whether there would be a natural slump in the ambitions. In some ways, in many cases, that would be understandable as well, because they had to deal with lots of things. But we do an annual survey of our members to ask them what they have achieved, what their commitments look like. And we feel really excited last year. So it's always in September. So last year, September is when we gathered the data for the previous year. And we saw very clearly that not only has the membership grown, has the number of vehicles grown very substantially, but also the vehicles actually put on the road as electric already to that date had grown by almost 100%. So I think that clearly shows that, so embedded in strategy that basically companies continue. And then I think what happens obviously around a time such as COP is, there's more awareness comes in, we want to engage on this. What are maybe bigger pieces that we can address at this point? So the visibility rate raises, but at the same time, I think, companies have been working on this for a while and will continue to take it seriously.
Yeah, exactly. It's a big decision for a company to jump, and they're not going to do it suddenly on a whim. It's going to be something that I've been preparing for months and months. Stuart, talk us through, your decision to get on board with this. How difficult was that as a business? What were the things you had to think about, particularly as you said you're a global organization?
So I think, for us, we clearly have now a lot of strong dialogue with our customers around their ambitions around more sustainable mobility and transition to EVs. We've talked a lot about that this morning. And I think we see that a lot of our corporate clients are at different levels of maturity and aspirations on that journey. So we see our role very much sort of mobilizing our business and our offering to help those businesses on that journey. And that's a combination of lots of things, whether that's driving more accessible EV ownership through benefit in kind propositions, for example, which is we're seeing huge acceleration in the corporate fleet through that offering. And I think that's obviously committed out now to 24. So I think any further clarification and commitment beyond that from a benefit in kind position, just I think for us gives more confidence for us and our clients to further invest in that as a mechanism. And I think also in the LCVs, we've talked quite strongly about that throughout this morning. And for us, it's just really making sure that we've got the right knowledge, either coming through COP in terms of the NDCs and what that means to us and what that means to the wider business community, and making sure that we've got the right expertise and knowledge such that when our customers come to us for guidance and advice on how and when they should be transitioning their fleets to more sustainable methods or EVs, then we have the right skill set to be able to advise them and make sure that they're transitioning on the right timeline that suits their business and their fleet needs.
Talk a little bit about the push dynamics, right? Was it your customers coming to you saying, look, we really need you to try and push, go greener faster. We really want this, for you to do it. Was it you having to go to your customers and saying, look, we're going to try and decarbonize and we want you to come with us on the journey? What was the driving force?
I think it's a combination of both. I think we're a hugely customer first organization. And I think part of the drive for us to really accelerate everything we're doing around sustainable mobility, whether it's mass, car sharing, e-bikes, or EV advice, has come through our customers, both at a UK level and of course across our European network of customers. But equally, I think as an organization, it's something that's really important to us. It's just part of our DNA across our global organization. So I think it's something that we've been on the front foot with, and equally taking that to a lot of our customers to really help them understand what their KPIs, what their agenda, what their journey could and should look like, just to demystify and give them confidence leading up to 2030 and the different timelines that exist for their fleet. So I would say a combination of both factors.
It's interesting when you see different different companies coming and doing this. I remember when Volvo decided to fully decarbonize their supply chain, they went to all their suppliers and said, we're going fully green and carbon neutral, and we expect you to as well. And all the suppliers said, oh yes, that's fine. And then Volvo came back and said, and we're going to use blockchain to monitor everything that you're doing. And the customer and all their suppliers said, oh right, you're really serious about this. So I think there was a bit of an awakening there. And I imagine some of you have had the similar impact when you go and talk to people and they go, oh right, no, you mean this for real? And we go, yes, we mean this for real. Catherine, can I come to you next and just talk a little bit more about some of the impact this is going to have, again, on small businesses, particularly a question we've had coming on carbon reporting. Right, there's going to be a shift to carbon reporting, to accounting for how a business, is carbon intensive, how its suppliers are carbon intensive. Is that something that's even possible for small businesses to do? How expensive is it? What help is it? What help is there to help them do that?
Yeah, definitely. That's a really, really key question. I think just to give it a little bit of context. So in June this year, the Crown Commercial Service and Government released PPN 0621, which is all about public procurement. So that's about companies who want to apply for a contract, for example, over £5 million will have to, in essence, be a net zero company. So what accompanied that PPN was a carbon reporting template. So businesses had to fill that in, and it was incredibly simple. So this doesn't have to be difficult. It certainly doesn't have to be expensive, and we certainly don't expect small businesses in particular to have to pay for any of this. There are plenty of free tools and resources available to small businesses. You might even say that there are too many tools and resources out there at the minute because everybody wants to help. Every organization is developing their own carbon reporting tool, for example. So I think a key role for us as government is to help simplify that landscape. And the way that we've tried to do that, again, is work with the SME Climate Hub. So businesses visiting that site will be able to see what tools and resources are available to them. We'll be able to pick and choose which one suits them best, because of course no two small businesses are the same. A small restaurant is going to be different to a small law firm, for example. So we want to make sure that there is sufficient variety there for businesses to choose which tool suits them best. But again, I push back on the assumption that it has to be costly or time consuming, because the whole point of this, again, the whole point of businesses achieving the benefits of net zero is understanding just how simple and straightforward it can be to start, taking that first step back and looking at the different sources of emissions within their business, because I appreciate they may not have done that before. No,
exactly. And you say there were too many options. Are businesses coming to you because they're, frankly, discombobulated by all the different ways they can try and do this? Is there a one-stop shop they can use?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what we've tried to do is start sort of lay the foundation for that. So I think that the end goal obviously would be to create a one-stop shop advice service. I think that is much needed. I think government has a key role to play there, obviously working with key stakeholders. But I think, looking at what the SME Climate Hub has tried to do in advance of COP, I mean, that is in essence, the single source of advice for small businesses on net zero. And from there, we can obviously signpost them off to different resources and different tools as necessary. But the core information they need about the benefits that their business could be getting from starting their net zero journey is all on there. It's in the tools library on the SME Climate Hub.
And what is obviously a lot of, people watching this are fleet managers in the fleet business more generally, or the rental or leasing business. What is the one thing that they can do to help?
Make the SME climate commitment. So this is a universal ask of all businesses, regardless of which sector you're in. Obviously, you've highlighted the fact that clearly transport is one of the big sources of emissions in the UK, one of the biggest. So what we want to say is, look, start your net zero journey, stand up and be counted, make your commitment, and we can go from there.
Well, that's a commitment. What can they do? What's the first step they can do kind of practically to reduce their emissions?
It really does depend on the business. So again, if you're a fleet, clearly then the majority of emissions are going to come from your fleet. So we would obviously ask businesses to look at cleaner forms of transport. Perhaps they might not be able to switch overnight and completely swap out their fleet for EVs. We appreciate that for small businesses in particular, that might be particularly challenging. So at this stage, we're looking at them to make a plan, really, to start planning, okay, if you can't do it now, when can you start looking at introducing EVs into your fleet? Are you going to do it at the end of your lease, for example? Can you swap out some vehicles now? We really do want them, again, to start making a concrete plan to reducing their emissions.
And one of the things I've heard, we've heard throughout the morning is, is people who run fleets or are in charge of fleets saying, look, we'd love to, but the product just isn't there yet. There aren't the vans we need, there aren't the specialist vehicles we need, and they're not coming, frankly, because the car makers are focusing on cars and they're not focusing on vans. Is there any sort of advice you'd have for businesses, Catherine, in that context?
I think having worked at Transport for London, so I must flag that I am broadly familiar with the options that are available to drivers out there. I think look a bit more broadly about the kind of vehicle that you're using. Again, lots of businesses may have had, a big Ford Transit, for example, they've had for 20 years. Do you still need that size of van? Is it possible perhaps to break it down into smaller vehicles that could perhaps be a bit more efficient, a bit more nimble in an urban context, for example? So I think, again, now is the chance, the opportunity for businesses to kind of rethink the way they've always done things, rethink the vehicles they've always had, the vans they've always had, for example, and think, well, maybe, perhaps, again, in an urban context in particular, perhaps a cargo bike could actually work quite well. Just to think, again, a bit more laterally about the sorts of options and cleaner forms of transport that are out there and are cheaper.
No, exactly. Maybe next year we'll end up with a panel on cargo bikes. Sandra, can I come to you next? Look, in terms of how the UK stands, right, compared to other places around the world, we obviously know it's ahead in electric vehicles and ahead in some of the incentives for that. Is it ahead in general, in your perspective, around decarbonisation? Is it one of the easiest places for big businesses to try and decarbonise? And are there things from other countries that other countries are doing that we could learn from here to help businesses here?
So I'm not sure I'm qualified to compare every country's climate strategy sort of across the board. I think, and quite often you see that some countries are leading in one places and another, and less so in others. So I think that's where a lot of the learning obviously comes in as well. I think in general terms, from my perspective, it absolutely always helps to have targets. It helps to have net zero targets. It helps to then have interim targets for those as well. And it also helps to then have sectoral targets to understand what is the role of transport, for example, in this case. So the 2030 target that the UK now has adopted for the end of petrol and diesel vehicle sales by 2030, I think that's extremely crucial. And then it's really, getting down into the nitty-gritty of what does that actually mean in terms of the concrete policy. So it's also making sure that once you have that, how do you break it down? So with the companies that we work with, for example, we're quite supportive of the debate right now around the ZEF mandate, because I think that's a really good way to make sure that there's not just a big 2030 target, but there's also a trajectory to get there and sort of a joint trajectory that everyone can align with. So I think those things are very important. Then you get into the details of charging infrastructure and all these types of things that maybe is not the point to discuss today. But I think there's no one general piece, but I think you see, if there's one rule, then the ones that have the biggest targets or very clear top line targets and are then doing the work to break them down, I think that's what really drives the change. And that's true for governments. And in some ways, I think that's true for businesses as well. I think the ones that have sort of comprehensive climate strategies that know what their carbon footprint is and that are able to link that to their corporate strategy as well to understand what the biggest opportunities for change are and where they should start on their journey or what are the next big pieces that they need to tackle. I think those are the ones that are probably doing the best overall.
It's been very interesting. Obviously, you talk about national rules. We've also seen huge impact of local rules. Like with London has the ultra low emission zone, and that's just recently expanded. And obviously, when that came in, there was a huge push by people, businesses, and consumers to change vehicles in and around those areas. It's actually driven far more detail and far more change among people than even some of the big national schemes have. We've had some questions coming in. Catherine, maybe this is one for you. There's a question here on LCV sharing. Is it an option in an urban environment? I mean, is it possible for businesses, say, to move from having, a fleet that is solely their fleet to having more shared vehicles? That'll obviously reduce congestion. Is that going to be viable for businesses to go down that route as a way of maybe decarbonising earlier?
I think going slightly outside of my remit here, and again tapping into my previous role in leading air quality ahead of the introduction of the ultra low emission zone. So that, I mean, it is possible again for businesses to adopt a different structure. For example, if you have a van, for example, as I mentioned, that you've owned, for example, and you only tend to use that once a week to go to the wholesaler, for example. Do you actually need to own a van? Is it possible, actually, as we saw in trials with Zip Van at Brixton Market, for example, a few years ago, whether it's possible just for businesses to borrow a van when they need it? So I think absolutely there are plenty of different business models out there that work out more efficient, cheaper for the business. They save on various congestion charges, etc., that may be present in certain cities. So again, it's just really important, I think, for businesses to just take that step back and look at which business model might suit them best, bearing net zero in mind.
Thank you. We've had a few questions come in. Thank you for those. Do keep them coming. Catherine, you won't be terribly surprised to hear quite a lot of those questions are for you. One is about tax subsidies and incentives for small businesses. How viable is it for governments to continue tax subsidies over the next decade to try and encourage small businesses to electrify? Is that a viable way of doing it? Are there other measures we might see in the next few years instead?
I think, again, this is obviously a question for my DFT colleagues to answer more fully, but I think, again, it's just really important that we continue to support small businesses on their net zero journey, and that might take, a variety of different forms. For example, we will be introducing legislation around clean heat in future years, for example. So there are lots of different ways that we can help support businesses, lots of different ways that we can help nudge them in the right direction. Obviously, tax subsidies are one element of that, but I wouldn't want to comment further than that.
No, that's absolutely fine. It's always funny when you get people from government on there. The two favourite answers are, that's a question for Treasury, or that's a question for another department, which is just the way that government works. Stuart, can I come to you next? What do you think? We've talked a little bit about ownership with the previous answer about van sharing. We're seeing ownership changes in the car industry in general. We're seeing it obviously particularly among passenger cars in urban centres. Is it something that's viable for commercial vehicles, and how does something like that fit into a sort of leasing model?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think generally on the topic of sharing, I think part of the benefit of us being part of a wider global organisation is we are already implementing and have been running car sharing models in other European markets quite successfully. So we're on a bit of a watching brief, having a look at what works, how that works in the environment context. We haven't gone as far as LCVs, but I think it's a really interesting concept. And I think the approach that we tend to take on the LCV side is that even today, albeit I think only 2% or I think 5% of the OEM catalogue is LCVs at the minute. So there is a shortage of choice, which we've covered. But that doesn't mean to say that the time is right for some use cases. So we're working very closely with our LCV fleets to understand how they're using their LCVs. I completely agree with Catherine's point on, if you look at that last mile delivery model, should that be a van? Could that be a cargo bike? Is it a combination of different solutions? So we're actively working with different partners on those aspects of LCV or, urban mobility as well. And van sharing, I think, I agree with Catherine, I think it's very much down to the use case of the van and the business. I think one question we get quite a lot from LCV communities, effects of payload on range. So we did a piece of work at Millbrook, commissioned a study on exactly that, looking at the payload impact on LCV range. And that's just all about us providing information, knowledge and confidence to the LCV community when they're making their decisions. Because there are lots of van or LCV use cases today that can transition to ELCVs. And I think I agree with Catherine. I think in that urban context, if the use case suits van sharing, it sounds like a sensible place to go. Yeah.
Exactly. That's what John was saying in one of the earlier panels, is that actually just because 1 in 10 of your jobs is not suitable for electric van doesn't mean that you can't move to an electric van for the others at the moment, which is
exactly.
Again, interesting and a question for business owners. We've now had a couple of questions come in on cities specifically. Catherine, this might be you with your prior hat on, who's probably best placed to answer these. One is the 15-minute city being adopted in the most cities across the UK? Is that something that would help increase urban decarbonisation?
That's a really interesting question, actually. I know Paris did that as well, again, a few years ago. So it is absolutely about sort of enhancing those local communities and making sure that various facilities, etc., are more accessible. I think it is one of the options. I couldn't possibly comment and then sort of come down hard either way. I'm going to sit on the fence on that one, but I think absolutely it is really exciting to see what can be done with those sorts of initiatives and how businesses react to that. And obviously, again, we're looking at absorbing best practice and promoting, the best ideas from other countries, especially. I mean, it is absolutely a really great option.
When you're looking at other countries, other cities, the likes of Amsterdam come to mind, with kind of their various transport offerings. What are the other cities that we should be thinking about as places that the UK in general, obviously London and the other cities here, can learn from?
I think, again, that would be a matter for Transport for London, absolutely, again, given we don't have a remit there. But I think it absolutely is really exciting. Amsterdam, again, is a great example. Paris is another great example. You know, there are cities across Germany and across the Netherlands as well that are doing some really, really exciting things and really sort of pushing the boundaries. Again, it's not just about swapping out, you know, one van for an electric van. It's about thinking, again, more broadly about the types of options that are available. You know, do I need to do things in the same way I've always done? Or is there another option here that I can look at? For example, we've mentioned cargo bikes already.
Yeah. Sandra, when you're talking to companies about joining the EV100 scheme, and obviously there's now more than 100 of them, you said, signed up, so maybe you'll need a rebranding at some point. But when you're talking to them about joining the scheme, how much does the whole city changing urban transport models feature in that discussion? Is it something they say, well, most of our business is city-based, therefore it is easier to decarbonize than it would be if we were a big organization based serving rural communities, for instance?
So I think so. First of all, EV100 is actually about the 100% commitment. So we'll be very happy to welcome lots more members. There is no limitation to that. In terms of the cities, yes, that's absolutely important. I think that's part of, I guess in some ways, cities are an easy starting point, right? Where some of the pressures are coming together. I mentioned earlier, zero emission zones is one of the key drivers where companies, even down to economic terms, when they need to make the case. Quite often we work with the sustainability teams, and then they need to take the decision to their boards and explain why they think this is the right thing to do. And, those companies like IKEA, for example, when they joined, made a very clear case and looked at Amsterdam, said there's going to have a zero emission zone in the city center. This is how many of our customers live there, and this is how much of our potential revenue might be at stake if we don't get this right. So let's get started and let's go on that journey. So I think that's one of the bits. Obviously, city centers also have the benefit, I think, as you said, that in some ways the distances you have to travel are quite small. They tend to be where the charging infrastructure is already more integrated. So that's a good starting point. But I think also it does branch out really. This is a different example, but I was recently in Germany at home in a rural area, and was actually very surprised to see how many farms have their solar panels on the roof and then the charging station in front. So I think this cliche of it's only in the city is only sort of the urban people that are moving in this direction, I don't think it's quite true. Of course, if you live in a very remote area, it might take a little bit longer for the economic case for the charging infrastructure to work if you can't put it in your own front yard in some way. But I do think it is spreading, and as we've said before, you start with the bits that are possible. I think it's very important to focus on that and how much that is growing and how rapidly it is growing, and then at some point we get to the bits that are most difficult as well.
Exactly, and particularly when you look at that rural example you cited, the possibility for rural operations to be off grid, to be using their own renewable sourcing of energy, their own solar power, etc., really changes the equation for them in terms of potentially turning electric or turning decarbonized in the future. Chris, we've got a couple of minutes left. I want to come to you. When you're talking to different organizations and trade groups about what they're doing on decarbonization, how much does the whole city question feature? The fact that there are changing rules they have to comply with, the fact that it is broadly easier to decarbonize if you're in a city. Is that a big impact for any of the people you're talking to?
I think it varies a lot between sectors. So some sectors that we're working with, for instance, water or waste industry or farming, they are much more geographically spread out, and say their operations are further out. So they need to be thinking about how can they get their vehicles out to those sorts of areas. So it's not just about the city end, it's actually about the where the stuff's coming from in the first place. So I think it underlines the need for working across sectors to make sure that you get the full coordinated action to make the supply chains work all the way through, so that decarbonisation can work across the board.
Great, perfect. Well, we have about 2 minutes left, so I'm going to go around each of the panel, ask for your final thoughts, both about the long-term challenges of embedding decarbonisation and also about COP. Stuart, we'll start with you, and I'll work our way back up the screen.
So I think for us, it's just a continuation of the investment in the gaps. I think we still have, principally around LCV supply, infrastructure confidence, don't so much about range anxiety, but charge anxiety. Does it work when I get there? On-street parking. So I think, we've got 60 charge points that are free at our place of work. We now have 90% penetration of our company car fleet is electrified. So I think it's investment in those core infrastructure and enablers that I think will generate the confidence to allow us to transition to EVs.
Perfect. Thank you. Sandra.
So for me, I think in some ways in the long term, it's about making sure that all these targets get translated into real action. And as I've said before, COP is an important milestone, but we need to keep going after that. And I think, I obviously want to invite everyone to be part of that. And maybe my final message would be just do it in a public way if you can as well. I think, it came up in the conversation with Catherine earlier, sort of this question of what do you do if the vans aren't available? I think there's a piece where we can overcome quite a lot of those barriers if we don't stop by saying I need this van, I can't have it, so I'm not going to do anything. But if enough people come together and sort of have the same need for a van and start a conversation, then suddenly it might become possible. And we have some really great examples from, again, IKEA, for example, who went out and talked to MAN and other manufacturers and basically got a purpose-built vehicle exactly to their specifications and agreed to say, if you build this for us, we'll take it to all our suppliers and invite them to use it. And that's how it all came together. So I think that's one of the big reasons that we're doing work like EV100, because we believe that if companies are visible about their ambition, saying this is what we're going to do by 2030, that also puts them in the front line to be approached about partnerships. And that sends a really important signal to the rest of the market as well, that there is actually a potential to be investing in these directions. So big invitation for anyone to join. I think there's been plenty of examples across the board today for the different ways you could be doing that.
Well, that's a fascinating example as well. We saw that with, for instance, Amazon getting bespoke delivery vehicles made for them by Rivian, that are going to be fully electric, that are going to help them decarbonize their fleet over time as well. Chris, final thoughts.
I think of the various themes at COP26, that about working together is absolutely critical. And there's a massive opportunity for firms in this sector to embrace that idea and come together through BVRLA and the others to work on solutions collaboratively and share them, especially with smaller businesses, because you're part of the solution. I also think it's really important that as time progresses, we make sure that we're capturing the kind of co-benefits of decarbonisation that has been touched upon as we go along. But if you're a small business, your consumers are not just concerned about their carbon impact, but also about what their local environment is like, what their air quality is like, and pushing for zero carbon is also going to have benefits of those types as well. And those things need to increasingly get built into businesses and plans to demonstrate the full range of benefits that we're going to get from this better world that we're heading towards.
Perfect, thank you. And Catherine, final thoughts.
I think really great points have already been made. I think my key one would be about keeping the momentum going post-COP. I think, as Sandra mentioned, it's really, really, really important that we don't just see COP as the end. It's very much the start of this conversation with small businesses. We've opened this door. We've got to keep going. We've got to keep communicating the benefits of net zero, and then listening to small businesses going forward to see, what it is they need. What are we doing right? What are we, what could we do better, etc. So really, again, really important that we keep this engagement going.
Perfect. Thank you very much. We are out of time, but thank you so much, Catherine, Chris, Stuart, and Sandra, for your thoughts there.